Hello there, I'm Jimmy Vegas, and today I want to talk about the Resident Evil series. With Resident Evil 9 seemingly on the horizon, coming up real soon in 2025, and with it being very recently rumoured to be announced, I think it's only fair to talk about what the series has been, why I like it, let's talk about the games, and what Resident Evil 9 could mean for you and me. Resident Evil started in 1996 as this corny, goofy Jill sandwich game. It was good, it was different, and for the time, it worked. Resident Evil 2 ended up being rebooted, seemingly, because nobody in the development team liked where Resident Evil 2 was going. It was too similar to the first. In hindsight, I don't think it was, because a lot of people have seen Resident Evil 2 original, which is 1.5 as we refer to it now, but I think it looked alright. And it went from there. Over the years, Resident Evil has had remakes more than you would imagine. Because if we think about it logically, this right here, Resident Evil Origins, contains Resident Evil 1, but not the Resident Evil 1 that came out in 1996. That was remade in the early 2000s. We ended up with this as well, being released later on. So in and of itself, Resident Evil has been remade, remastered several times. Resident Evil 0 is probably the second most disliked Resident Evil in the series, but I don't mind it. It was weird and it was different. But that's just what Resident Evil is. It's weird, it's different. It takes things out of context and plays with things for a bit of fun sometimes. It tries to be serious, but it also tries to be wacky and goofy. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. As we found out with Resident Evil 0, it was weird and strange, but it wasn't wacky and goofy. Resident Evil 2 Remake, I would say, is probably the greatest remake ever made behind the original Resident Evil. Yes, I own it twice. But it's not quite as good as I would have hoped. Yes, I know things were different and it really stayed true to the original of Resident Evil 2. But there's just something about the original Resident Evil 2, the blockiness and the pre-rendered backgrounds, which just really stood out and I felt was better. But Resident Evil at this point was taking a more serious turn. Resident Evil 3, although the remake had a lot of content cut, the original was a really, really good game, followed in the footsteps of Resident Evil 2. But with the addition of Nemesis in here, it took Mr. X one step further and had that stalker enemy much more active, although he could have been better in the remake. Resident Evil Code Veronica, which I don't have physical, I used to on Dreamcast, but I no longer do, unfortunately. But I have it digitally. That was where I feel the series took its true wacky nature to the next level. Steve Burnside was a weird character. The problem with Code Veronica in today's society is the character of Alfred Ashford. And if you haven't played Code Veronica, I would implore you to go and play it and try and understand that character. This is one of the reasons why I don't think Code Veronica will ever get a remake unless they completely change the twins of Alexia and Alfred. Without going too much into it and getting myself cancelled and demonetised, there are things which were deemed okay and appropriate back then to not make fun of, but play in a way that seemed derogatory. That's not acceptable in today's society, unfortunately. So the character of Alfred and Alexia would have to be changed drastically for Code Veronica to get a remake, which is why we're doing this video, and at the end I will explain why I believe Resident Evil 9 is indeed the right choice. After Code Veronica, we got Resident Evil 4. No, this is not the remake. I do have the remake, we'll get to that. But this Resident Evil 4 is considered the greatest Resident Evil ever. It's been released on countless consoles. It's been released multiple times in different forms, whether it's VR, whether it's on the Wii, where you slice and whatever. Capcom milked it as far as I'm concerned. It's a good game, don't get me wrong, it's a good game. I played it on the GameCube and I still got it on the GameCube somewhere. But this is the remastered version that they put on PlayStation 4 a couple of years ago. Next up we have Resident Evil 5. This is a strange one because I like Resident Evil 5, but not as a solo player. I've often found Resident Evil 5 to be more geared towards having fun with a buddy online or split screen with whoever would want to play with you. This is the point where they thought Resident Evil was going to just go in any direction and people would buy it. It is, I believe, at least at the time of putting this out, a couple of years later. It was the best selling Resident Evil game. It's good. I love the fact Chris is in it. Chris is a hell of a guy. Boulder Puncher Chris. We never saw Sheva again, though. And it's weird because Sheva is a much bigger character than Jill Valentine. And yet Jill is on the front. Resident Evil 6. This is where Capcom just hit a brick wall. I'll be honest, I like Resident Evil 6, but I understand why people don't. It went too far. Its wackiness turned into a serious wackiness, which was just daft. It wasn't wacky and funny and goofy anymore. There was too much going on. It was too over the top. It was too overproduced. When you get an album from a band and it just sounds too overproduced. It sounds okay, but you just feel like their older stuff was better because it wasn't as overproduced. That's Resident Evil 6. Resident Evil 7, Biohazard, is where things changed probably forever. Now, Resident Evil 7, if you don't know, ended up being first person, and it worked. I can't tell you what it was about it, but Resident Evil 7 is a fantastic game. I absolutely adore it. Is it the first person? Is it because it went back to its roots, but in a first person view? Possibly. It felt enclosed, it felt tight, it didn't feel overproduced like Resident Evil 6. It worked. Capcom knew it worked. We'll get to what happened after that in a second, but first, we have a couple of games which altered the perspective of Resident Evil a little. The Revelations series, I have on PS3, PS4, and I have Revelations 2 on PS4 as well. Now, Revelations was originally released on the 3DS, and I don't own that version, unfortunately. But it was something a little bit different for Resident Evil. This felt like it was going back to its original form before Resident Evil 7 came out. That's why a lot of people, you'll find, actually love the Revelations series, because it feels like an older Resident Evil game in a modern world. And it really, really was, and it was fantastic. It's so good. Revelations 2, I feel, is better than Revelations. Again, I couldn't tell you why. Even though it was episodic, there was episodes to it and whatever else. Maybe because Barry Burton was back in it. Who knows? But the wackiness and goofiness was toned down just a little bit in this. So it's a bit more serious. But that was okay, because it worked as a Resident Evil title. This one, I think, changed the world. This, Resident Evil Village, or Resident Evil 8 Village, whatever you want to call it, was a fantastic game. But Capcom knew people still wanted that third-person view. That's why, eventually, this got a third-person patch. So you could play the game first-person, like it was initially intended, or you could play third-person. Capcom have changed and played with things over the years, and realistically, they know what they need to come back to. They've experimented with all these other games that we've just been through, and this one was the biggest experiment of all. I think this only existed to see if people were happy with the way this was portrayed, i.e. a village. They knew they could cash in on the next one. Resident Evil 4 Remake. Now, when this was first announced, there were many people, including myself, that said, why do we need a Resident Evil 4 remake? Resident Evil 4 is already good. And you know what? This blew everyone away. What a game this is. It's just next level. Above a next level. It is a fantastic remake. Of all the Resident Evil remakes, you can tell that the budget went into this one. A hell of a budget went into Resident Evil 4 Remake. I can only imagine what the budget is on this. Probably half of what Resident Evil 4 was, because this was the test for Resident Evil 4, and it paid off. This Resident Evil 4 Remake looks better, it plays better, it sounds better, and it retains all the craziness, wackiness, seriousness of the original. This is the perfect remake. I would say, maybe actually it's better than the original Resident Evil remake. But where does that leave Resident Evil now? It leaves Resident Evil in a place where do you go? Is open world the right way to go? No, I don't think it is. But there has been rumours of Resident Evil 9 being open world, and do you know what? I don't think it will be. I think Resident Evil 9 will, to a degree, have an openness to it, but it will not be open world. I would expect Resident Evil 9 to contain probably most of the characters we've seen over the years. You can only imagine what Capcom's thoughts are going to be. Let's look at the characters in a list, in an order of who they love. Chris and Jill are always going to be top. Claire and Leon are always going to be underneath. That sounds a little bit wrong, but you get the point of what I'm saying. Seeing as Leon has just had his own remake right there, and seeing as Chris was in Village, I would expect the main character of 9 to be Jill. Am I right? Am I wrong? Who knows? But what's after Resident Evil 9? We get Resident Evil 9 in 2025. Where do you go from here? Well, as I mentioned earlier, a Code Veronica remake I think is off the table until they sort the character of Alfred. Can they do it? Yeah, they probably will. They'll rework it, they'll rewrite it, but I don't think that's the priority at the moment. The big priority, I believe, will be this. After Resident Evil 9, I truly believe we will get a Resident Evil 5 remake. People will say, why do we do a Resident Evil 5 remake? Look at it, holds up. Do you know what? No, it doesn't quite hold up. I've recently been playing this version on the PS3 with my son. We've been playing through it together over PSN, having a bit of a laugh, having good fun, getting Chevy shout, come on, come on, come on, come on. It's just funny. But it doesn't hold up in today's world. Could you imagine Resident Evil 5 in the Resident Evil 4 engine being remade that way? That could be a recipe for pure genius. But then what after Resident Evil 5 remake? Where do you go from there? Resident Evil 10? No, I don't think we'll get Resident Evil 10, not for a long time, probably 2030. I think after that, the Resident Evil series will more than likely go for another Revelations game. Resident Evil Revelations 3. That would be the logical step. After that one, another logical step would be either remaking the original Resident Evil properly, as has been rumoured but has been proven false. I think there is a bit of truth to that somewhere. Resident Evil 0 and Resident Evil 1 probably need something. That's when we'll get Resident Evil 10, and then after 10, that's when Capcom will finally sort themselves out and we get a Code Veronica remake. But where does that go after then? How far can a series go? Who knows? I mean, who ever imagined that you'd get this far into Resident Evil? Look at all them. And that's not even all of the Resident Evil games. Yeah, I know there's a couple of duplicates there because I got them on different consoles, and there are some more somewhere in my house. But Resident Evil is a series that will continue for a long, long time. But what Capcom chooses to do with it, how far can they go with remakes? Can they really remake the remake of Resident Evil 2 in 15 years' time? Is that going to go down well? Who knows? But either way, there is a lot more to come with Resident Evil, and I am looking forward to Resident Evil 9 in 2025. What about you?